The rain began to drum upon the tiles of Flaxborough's abbey roof just as the congregation realized that something had gone terribly amiss. The hymnals, dog-eared survivors of countless services, had been distributed, yet a sharp-eyed parishioner was the first to notice that pages were missing here and there. Whole sections of familiar songs neatly torn away, leaving gaps both literal and unsettling. Odd laughter rippled through the church until the vicar's thin cough restored silence. Then, as if the trick had not been enough, a folded slip of paper was found tucked inside one hymnal, a line written with measured ink, more declarative than devotional. "The voice stilled shall return." The choir froze at its reading, uncertain if they were part of the service or audience to a performance gone sour. Someone dropped a book, the thud echoing where a hymn ought to have been. The scandal had begun, not with death, but with silence in a place built on song. In a town where gossip drives as fast as an ambulance and twice as recklessly, contradictory accounts began at once. The verger muttered about mischief by the local schoolboys. Mrs. Tunley at the bakery blamed visiting Methodists. A council member dismissed it dryly, insisting the parish budget could hardly afford conspiracies. At the shoulder of the pub counter, a coal merchant opined knowingly that the missing pages held secrets unfit for pious eyes. Another regular swore the town librarian had been seen at odd hours, by candlelight, sneaking hymnals away. Each voice contradicted the next until suspicion lined every ale-glass, every shop-front remark, every too-smooth dismissal by those with reason to prefer the matter buried. Already a web was woven, and half the town's weavers would proclaim themselves innocent. Inspector Purbright arrived without fuss, taking note first not of the hymnals, nor even of the hostile whispers, but of an oddly incongruous marker, a brass paperclip. It rested, too shiny, too modern, between the torn pages of one book set aside in the vestry. None of the church's desk drawers possessed the like. That detail, small and photographable, carried more significance than all the speculation combined. Purbright's gaze lingered, allowing no hint of triumph, only a quiet invitation for others not nearly so attentive. Sergeant Love stood at his elbow, too earnest to leave the paperclip as an accident. "Inspector, who'd go to the trouble for just this?" he asked. Purbright's eyes drifted across the ropes of shifting faces in the nave, then closed briefly. "Consider," he murmured, "how rarely a torn page belongs only to itself." It was his way to bend the obvious until it revealed its other face. He pressed no panic into his voice, only that steady, contemplative cadence that left listeners unsure whether they were being enlightened or gently mocked. Yet a ripple of nervous titters testified that at least someone heard challenge in his words, perhaps even warning. He was the sort of man who, by softly articulating the smallest observation, could make half a room feel complicit. Nothing brash, nothing underlined, just a reframing that slipped through the gossip smoke like a clear breeze. His remark would become, within hours, the quoted line of the day. How rarely a torn page belongs only to itself. Shared in kitchens, muttered in queues, and eventually featured in bold letters on the community forum. Then, just as calm threatened to return, the sexton burst through the vestry door, holding something he swore he'd never seen before. Inside an unused collection bag, folded tight, rested another note. This one was sharper, unmistakable. First the hymns, then the voice. No one sang now. The laughter had fled, replaced with the stunned recognition of malice. Someone in Flaxborough, it seemed, was staging more than vandalism. They were choreographing silence across the town's most public stage. The implications shivered through parishioners like a gust through chapel windows. Sergeant Love swallowed hard. Purbright only straightened his hat and said, so softly the congregation leaned forward as one, "We have not yet heard the beginning." And that was enough. Flaxborough was hooked, line and firmly snagged. So then, Purbright asked, the storm-beaten air as if to us. "What do you make of it?" The congregation still lingered despite the vicar's meek assurances that the service could not possibly go on. It was human nature, Purbright reflected, to claim outrage at scandal while simultaneously refusing to leave the scene of it. The pews crackled with whispers like bushes alive with sparrows, and to many, the inspector's quiet presence was as theatrical as any organ prelude. Sergeant Love stood stiff at his side, his notebook clutched as if it might by itself compel answers. A church full of restless suspects is a troublesome luxury, Purbright thought, for everyone is eager to believe someone else guilty before the hymnals are even closed. Love leaned close enough that his breath fogged on Purbright's spectacles. "Sir, do you really take this to mean danger, or is it someone playing tricks for attention?" His voice was pitched too loudly, high enough for 2 pews' worth of eyes to swivel in their direction. Purbright lowered his chin an inch, effectively hushing both Love and the audience. "A prank that requires quiet precision and leaves deliberate fragments," he murmured, "is a curious prank indeed. Thieves of laughter tend not to employ brass paperclips." His gaze traveled along the aisle where hymnals lay abandoned. Several had been handled with surprising care, as though someone wished only to create absence rather than destruction. The observation folded neatly into the quiet puzzle building in his mind. The missing words were not a coincidence. They had been extracted with a surgeon's thoughtfulness, leaving congregants wondering whether the words meant less or more in their absence. Out in the square, word had already strayed from gossip to report. A small cluster of shopkeepers had drifted to the churchyard gates, each bringing their version of certainty. Mrs. Dinwiddie, proprietor of the haberdashery, declared confidently that no good could come of the council's relentless budget cuts. Why, hadn't they sacked 2 assistants from the records office just last month? "One of them's bound to have a grudge," she said, eyes gleaming. The verger, half inside the porch and half out, overheard and bristled. "Council cuts don't lead to hymnals losing their innards. That's mischief, plain and simple, probably schoolboys. They creep about the yard this time of year." A pale-headed regular from the Fox and Goose, whose beer-stained voice carried across the flagstones, scoffed. "Schoolboys? Huh! This reeks of librarians. Don't they live for pages more than people? A personal protest? I shouldn't wonder." In reply, Alderman Hargreave, red-faced from both authority and port, waved his stick grandly and growled that the entire debacle was nothing that need concern the public. That, of course, ensured greater concern. This chorus of village sureness provided the background against which Purbright worked best, quietly, entirely deaf to proclamations, yet absorbing all. The inspector took himself back through the vestry, gloved fingers brushing the hymnals until he reached the one with the paperclip. Its metallic glint felt almost boastful among the faded cloth bindings. He opened it once more, seeing where a page had been excised so cleanly that the stitch threads were left intact. He considered the possibility that the excised material was not destroyed but kept, perhaps to be returned in altered form. He tapped the clip gently against the oak table, rhythms of speculation. Love, meanwhile, had not perfected the art of silent inspection. He bustled from pew to pew, each question propelled forward with clumsy earnestness. "Sir, why not see if anyone's hands show ink stains? Whoever wrote the note must have done so recently. It's still sharp black." He tapped his notebook triumphantly as if this solved everything. Purbright tilted his head, indulgent but unswayed. "Sergeant, suspects rarely present themselves with hands obligingly soiled. Ink reveals less upon fingers than upon motives. Do watch for those instead." And then, just when the congregation's restlessness hovered on the brink of exodus, another discovery altered the room's weight altogether. The curate, a nervous youth of pale complexion, stumbled in with a collection bag. His hands shook visibly as he revealed a folded slip he'd found tucked deep inside, almost as though its placement had been deliberate bait. When unfolded, the words jumped out with an accusation sharper than the first. First the hymns, then the voice. Gasps shivered through the nave. A woman clutched her child. A man muttered a helpless curse. The mischief of torn pages had transformed into the possibility of a threat. Love rounded the pew too quickly and nearly tripped. "But this one, sir, that sounds like a warning, doesn't it? Whose voice? The vicar's, the choir's, or—" He stopped, aware too late that every eye in the room had turned upon the vicar, now pale and wringing his sleeves. Purbright placed the paper flat against the surface of an open Bible, letting candlelight fall across the words. He did not change expression, though the congregation strained to register it. His silence was heavier than exclamation. Finally, he adjusted his spectacles and spoke softly enough that people had to lean forward to hear. "A man who writes in threats does not begin with hymns unless his grievance is with voices themselves. We should ask, not whose voice will be stilled, but what silence he intends to feed." The statement fell like a stone into water, spreading ripples of new unease. Dirty glances darted over the congregation again, several doubling back to the council seats in the front pews. Long brewing rivalries fermented into suspicion overnight. The sheer breadth of potential grudges made every face suddenly remarkable. That was Flaxborough, a town where the air of civility was never far from the scent of scandal. At that moment, a small cough broke the charged silence. Mrs. Tunley had risen, lips pursed and handbag hugged close. She was a woman incapable of silence for longer than a kettle's boil. "If I may, Inspector," she announced, "only last week I myself saw a figure at the vestry door well after dark. I mentioned it to Edna Dobbs, so she'll tell you as a witness if she's not mine to pretend otherwise. The fellow skulked off when I called, but I swear he carried papers in his arms. Tall enough, with one of those clerk's coats and walking quick." Love immediately brightened. "That could be a lead, sir. Could be the very one who clipped and cut the hymnals." From the corner pew, Councilman Dacre snapped upright. "Nonsense! The vestry is locked, and no clerk of mine has time for such idiocies." His protest carried heat enough to convince at least half the congregation that he had either knowledge or guilt. Purbright acknowledged none of the outbursts, but he did lift the note once more, carefully folded. His eyes moved briefly to the paperclip resting on the table, then back to the threatening phrase. "If what Mrs. Tunley reports is true," he said mildly, "then someone rehearsed this drama carefully. The words are not for fright alone." He looked about the congregation without raising his voice. "Consider this, friends. An entrance requires its next act, and we have seen only a rehearsal." The ripple of unease transformed, in the way of all good mysteries, into chatter laced with fear, suspicion, and excitement. Purbright placed the note in his coat pocket as though sealing it for later revelation. To the unconvinced or the curious or the guilty, the message was now his alone, yet his words hung in the rafters like a dangerous hymn. If the first act was silence, what on earth awaited them for the second? Councilman Dacre's outburst did little to quell the whisper that had already taken root among the congregation. Facts mattered less than suggestions in Flaxborough, and a red face paired with a loud denial looked more like guilt than innocence. Purbright allowed the moment to ferment, for rushing such atmospheres rarely allowed the truth to surface. He had learned that allowing silence, even uncomfortable silence, often prompted more words than cross-examination. In the pews, people shuffled restlessly, each weighing not only what they thought they knew, but also what they wanted overheard. Purbright's soft tread drew him to the vestry again, where the hymnals with their unsettling gaps lay open like victims. He picked one up, tilting it beneath the flickering light. The tear was done with deliberate neatness, an almost surgical attention, ensuring no ragged edges remained to betray clumsiness. Yet scattered among the missing sections, grave inconsistencies whispered a clue. Not every torn-out page matched the same hymnal number. Some had been extracted from commonly sung hymns, others from obscure records that even the choir barely touched. A destructive hand wouldn't have chosen at random. It was a pattern waiting to be solved, though not solved yet. As he bent close, the faintest scent clung to the paper's edge. Lemon oil, narrow and pointed. Purbright inhaled again, and yes, there it was. A polish not from the church, but one used liberally upon office furniture. Council chambers or clerks' desks, not vestry floors. He made no announcement, merely brushed at his spectacles, his mildest version of revelation. Behind him, Sergeant Love struggled to keep order with too much zeal. "Please, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll just form a line along the aisle, Inspector Purbright will take your statements one by one." The demand, far beyond their intent or patience, drew awkward laughter and a wave of objections. A fisherman barked about wasted time, while Mrs. Tunley decided her handbag required visible inspection under everyone's eyes. The growing noise suggested little statement-taking would happen in any neat fashion. Purbright gently intervened by saying nothing at all. Instead, he replaced the hymnal on the stack and straightened his hat. The simple act calmed the room better than orders ever could, shifting eyes back to him in anticipation. Love's face reddened, but he duly retreated to his notebook, scratching furiously as though sheer penmanship might recover authority. A small cough emerged from the back pew, tentative yet oddly insistent. The librarian, Miss Ardley, austere and reed-thin beneath her neat beret, raised a finger like a schoolmistress. "Inspector, might I observe that hymnals are catalogued? I have copies of editions at the library, those very same prints. If pages were cut out, I should easily identify which." Her eyes glittered with something between pride and apprehension. "I keep indices, after all." Love jumped on it quickly. "We should search her library then, sir. See if the missing pages turn up there." His urgency lacked subtlety, and several parishioners muttered darkly that they had always suspected the librarian kept odd hours. Miss Ardley drew herself up, affronted at once. "I merely offer professional knowledge. I'll not have my stacks rifled through like a second-hand shop." Purbright intervened with characteristic calm. "Your index could indeed help us, Miss Ardley. If you're willing, please bring what copies you have tomorrow. I believe the hymnals themselves will tell us more when weighed against a fellow volume." His tone was not possibility, but certainty, and though the librarian looked unconvinced, she gave the smallest nod. The tension in the hall bent slightly toward relief, though never completely. Councilman Dacre, still clutching his walking stick as though to remind the town of his rank, muttered about wasted time. "All this over children's pranks. The council has more urgent work than cataloguing hymn books." Mrs. Tunley's sniff carried from the opposite side. "Councillor, if you had a hymn book by you on the Sabbath, perhaps you'd see the difference between children's pranks and blasphemy." "Mrs. Tunley," Purbright said gently, "let us refrain from sanctifying motives before we see the perpetrator's hand. Whatever we witness here is meant to play not upon heaven, but upon ourselves." That remark stilled the murmurs, as though his words pinned them within the rafters. More than one villager would recall the phrasing later in the Fox and Goose, repeating it with variations that only added to its power. At that moment, the verger reappeared from the belfry door, face pallid and uncertain. "Inspector, forgive. There's more. Someone's tampered with the hymn board by the pulpit." The words ignited fresh sounds. Outrage in some corners, curiosity in others, fear in more. Purbright moved without hurry, coaxing the crowd into motion as he approached the front. There, where hymn numbers would normally hang in brass-framed clarity, several wooden slats had been switched about. The sequence no longer matched the order of songs for that Sunday. Instead, it displayed 4 numbers that, on quick check, referred to hymns unrelated to the service at all. Love squinted at them, reciting clumsily from his service sheet. "Those aren't on today's list, sir. They look like, well, I don't know what they look like. Purbright read the numbers slowly, already reconstructing their meanings. Not what they look like, Sergeant. What they align with. He resisted the pleasure of pronouncement as he turned back to face the congregation. Each comes from the very hymns whose pages are gone. That truth struck like the toll of a bell, sharp and inevitable. Gasps once again filled the chapel. The tampering was no accident, no boy's prank. Someone wanted the congregation to see their absence and puzzle over it. "What's the sense of that, then?" Love blurted. "Why steal the pages only to point them out again?" The inspector's eyes softened, but his words were edged with calculation. "Because our visitor does not fear discovery, Sergeant. Quite the opposite. He craves it." The congregation drew as a single breath, as though some shadow had entered among them. Women clutched at their bags. Men shifted uneasily as suspicion turned its gaze like a swinging lantern. Among them, Purbright alone seemed composed, the storm's single calm eye. He closed his small notebook and slipped it into his coat. The vicar attempted a tremulous dismissal of the service altogether, urging his flock to depart quietly. But leaving was easier said than done. The aisles clogged with half-whispered assertions, exchanges of pointed stares, and premature accusations. What should have been dispersal became instead a theatre of suspicion, carrying its performance into the very square outside. Each villager bore not only their Sunday coat, but also their newly adorned certainty of who might be to blame. Only Purbright seemed in no rush. He lingered at the hymn board, eyes returning once more to those carefully rearranged numbers. His fingertips rested lightly on the brass hook of one slat, while his gaze turned to the note folded safely away in his pocket. First the hymns, then the voice. Symbols and silence, absence and threat. Whatever lay ahead, this was only the prologue preached in secret to a whole town assembled. Love hovered near, loyal but unsure. "Shall I take down the numbers, sir?" "No, Sergeant," Purbright answered gently, eyes still fixed upon them. "They were hung to be seen. Let them speak until we hear whose voice was meant to follow." The square outside the Abbey had grown into a restless hive by the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love stepped through the doors. The early dusk painted the roofs in dusky rows, yet all the gossip burning beneath was far less serene. Groups formed and splintered like shoals of fish, every member eager to declare the whole thing solved and someone's neighbor guilty. Purbright moved at an unhurried pace, the kind of calmness that frustrated the eager but steadied the sensible. He observed that no one was drifting home in the ordinary way. A scandal had knitted their coats to their gossip, and until more rumor was spun, Flaxborough would not yet disperse. Love stayed close behind, attempting a brisk tone, though his words betrayed excitement. "Sir, the hymn board, the missing pages, then those notes. It all ties together, doesn't it? You can almost see the hand behind it. There's a performance to it." He flushed, slightly as he realized that phrase sounded borrowed from the inspector's own. "I mean, whoever's doing this means for us to be led by the nose." "Perhaps," Purbright replied softly, tipping his hat politely to an elderly couple who eyed him as if hoping to overhear the solution. "Though being led by the nose depends on who is tugging and where they mean to stop." He glanced at the council offices across the square, shuttered now but looming in dark silhouette. "Our problem may not lie in who removed the hymns, but who expects us to listen for silence in the first place." From somewhere behind the haberdashery stall came a shrill protest. Mrs. Tunley, it seemed, had refashioned her testimony into greater drama, telling anyone willing to listen about the shadow she had glimpsed by the vestry. With each retelling, the figure grew taller, thinner, more sinister. By the current version, he carried not just papers under his arm, but perhaps a satchel full of secrets. The swell of sensation delighted shopkeepers, trading in suspicion as briskly as in bread. Love, always too earnest, looked ready to march across and take her story as evidence yet again. Purbright restrained him with only a gentle touch at the elbow. "It is unwise, Sergeant, to harvest wheat where only nettles have sprouted. Let Mrs. Tunley's recollections ripen further. They will bear more fruit when embroidered thoroughly." Love frowned but obeyed, pulling his notebook instead. "Shall we pursue the hymn numbers more directly, then? You said those missing pages match the ones displayed. What if they're part of some message in themselves?" "They are certainly intended as such," Purbright answered, though a message rarely whispers its own meaning at the outset. "A riddle delights in delay. Observe what it compels in the meantime. Argument, suspicion, unease. That is the nourishment being drawn from these pages, Sergeant. An audience as unsettled as this one is exactly the stage on which the next act may fall." Several villagers approached, pressing questions upon him. Was it true the choir boy spotted something strange? Had anyone confessed? Would there be arrests tonight? Purbright gave each the same measured smile and answer, "In due course, good people." Nothing sated them, but nothing betrayed his thoughts either, and one by one they shuffled back to their preferred clusters of conjecture. The crowd's murmurs thickened as Alderman Hargreave arrived with his impressive frame and a walking stick that thumped like an axe handle. He was not one to miss an opportunity to reclaim attention. "This is absurd, Inspector," he thundered. "Pages missing from old books and a silly board shuffled about. That hardly constitutes a menace. Mark my words, this town indulges hysteria." His gaze swept the crowd, inviting their support. "It was schoolboy vandalism, and I'll stake my reputation upon it." From the rear, a mocking voice retorted, "Easier to stake a reputation when you've one to spare." Laughter rippled, and the alderman colored dangerously. Purbright's steady expression never shifted, though he had already noted the use of schoolboys as an explanation. Too easy, too repeated. When an alibi is offered too quickly and often, it is usually prepared. Interesting, too, was that both the councilman and alderman sought dismissal, where others sought drama. Both extremes proved useful. The inspector excused himself politely, leading Love back into the quieter vestry. Inside, the smell of polish on wood and the faint wax of candles remained. Purbright stooped over the hymn board once more, this time making careful notes of the numbers, a process Love found frustratingly deliberate. "Sir, I could copy those at once." "You may," Purbright agreed mildly, "but understanding begins when one writes letters without yet knowing the word they spell. It leaves space for recognition when the word finally appears." He motioned then to the curate, the nervous young man still standing with pale fingers entwined. "Tell me, you found the second note in which collection bag?" The curate faltered, uncertain whether answering might incriminate him by accident. "I brought out the bag that had not yet been used, sir. It was stored at the back. I felt for the coins as we always do, and instead there was that." His hands hinted at trembling. Love perked up, sensing perhaps the bold clue. "So someone placed it beforehand, knowing it'd be used next service." Purbright tilted his head, which suggests forethought, but also that the one who placed it either knew the curate's pattern of use or wished it to be discovered tonight, not last Sunday, not next. Timing is often as telling as ink. He paused. "Did anyone have access to this bag before you yourself fetched it?" The curate darted a glance toward the verger, who bristled. "Most of the assisting staff could fetch a bag if needed," the verger snapped, "but we do not skulk about placing ungodly notes inside. I've been here near 30 years and keep the locks myself." "Locks," Purbright repeated absent-mindedly, focusing more upon the lemon oil scent he'd detected earlier. A lock could be kept true, yet keys wander often in towns like Flaxborough. He resisted voicing it, preferring instead to let Love note the verger's irritation. A defensive temper could serve nicely later when suspects needed thinning. The ringing of the half-hour bell drew attention again. Twilight deepened through the stained glass windows. Parishioners were at last dispersing, though not by choice, but by fatigue. The mystery was planted firm enough that tomorrow it would sprout across breakfast tables, in shop counters, on every lane where neighbour met neighbour. As they prepared to leave, Purbright glanced once more at the hymn board, the altered numbers gleaming faintly in dying light. Sergeant, each switch here was not clumsy. They were measured, placed in exact order. Someone wanted us to see their hand. He pocketed his notebook. Tomorrow we will visit Miss Ardley at the library. Books desire return even when their pages wander. Love nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. We'll match the missing to her catalogue. Then he lowered his voice timidly. But what of the note? About the voice. Do you think it means more than theatrics? Purbright adjusted his hat, the faintest smile upon his lips. One does not silence voices through theatrics, Sergeant. Only through intent. Let us hope, for Flaxborough's sake, that the intent remains upon paper. His glance returned briefly to the pews, empty now but filled still with echoes of suspicion. Though my suspicion is, paper never holds a grievance for long. Morning in Flaxborough arrived with the sort of brittle brightness that fools those who think a mystery might resolve itself in daylight. The townsfolk, busy with bread deliveries and cartwheels over cobblestone, found conversation returning compulsively to last evening's service. Rumour had already grown legs long enough to sprint from shop to shop. Some insisted the missing hymnal pages concealed blasphemous verses published by mistake years ago, and someone was determined to cover it up. Others whispered about secret codes that officials might have buried in local prayer books. The notion that it might be schoolboy mischief persisted only among those with simpler imaginations, or among those who needed that simplicity as cover. Purbright and Sergeant Love approached the library along High Street, its facade cleaner than most buildings in Flaxborough. The town council funded the place modestly, but Miss Ardley, its librarian, guarded her shelves like a convent. Even the brass doorknobs gleamed, polished to a shine that matched her uncompromising expectations. Love muttered as he walked, "Sir, I'll wager she'll make us wash our hands before we so much as glance at her index." "She has the advantage of order, Sergeant," Purbright replied in mild defence. "One ought not resent neatness merely because it is rare." Inside, Miss Ardley awaited them with an expression halfway between resolve and distaste. She stood behind the counter, clasping a long index volume already open for presentation. "I took the liberty of marking every hymnal edition used within the past 40 years. You will observe, which few of your parishioners likely would, that the editions have variations. Certain numbers differ, certain verses omitted. I naturally have annotated all such minutiae." Love straightened as though confronted with a superior officer. Purbright inclined his head, acknowledging not only her dedication, but the valuable benefit of obsession. He waited in silence until Ardley's pride cooled enough that she thrust the index toward them. It contained careful lists, cob-like detail of hymn numbers, cross-referenced, across editions. A narrow ribbon marked one section that had been adjusted in the very printings used by the Abbey. Purbright turned the leaves quietly. The missing hymns revealed themselves when compared against yesterday's numbers on the board. A neat alignment emerged where randomness had pretended to live. He tapped his finger along the page. "See, Sergeant? The numbers chosen correspond to those revised versions, the ones where verses were altered or omitted between editions. Whoever removed them knew exactly which songs would not match memory." Love leaned closer, fumbling at comprehension. So the act wasn't just to cut out any page, but specifically the ones that'd leave people wrong-footed when singing. They'd notice the gap straight away. A loss in the middle of certainty. Yes, familiar words are absent at the instant a community tries to share them. Nothing unsettles so quickly. You were there, Sergeant. Did you not feel how swiftly confidence drained when the voices discovered their pages missing? Love nodded, remembering the choir's faltering silence. He looked anxious. But then why add the notes about voices? Why escalate it? That escalation, Purbright said softly, is the part that interests me. Silence imposed is not merely inconvenient. It is a declaration. Miss Audley sniffed faintly, though her curiosity won against restraint. If you're asking my opinion, Inspector, it is clear your culprit is someone sufficiently read to understand additions, yet impassioned enough to consider notes and numbers as vehicles of expression. That narrows the field somewhat. A schoolboy could not possibly trace the additions. A council clerk, however, well, they are forever misplacing their expertise. She folded her hands neatly, as though to disclaim innocence by force of posture. Love scribbled rapidly in his book. Council clerk, possibility, librarian, suspicious knowledge. He wrote both down without noticing Audley's glare. Purbright closed the index volume carefully and handed it back. Knowledge is not suspicion, Sergeant. It is the use of knowledge that becomes so. Let us not indict custodians of books merely for understanding them. They left the library under skies grown heavier, clouds glooming over the square. On the steps, Love looked unconvinced. Still, sir, she's got more motive than most. Sharp, stern. Doesn't like when others touch her books. Might see the hymnals as some personal insult. Purbright said nothing, merely adjusted his spectacles and scanned the shop doorways where villagers eyed them in hope of gleaning conclusions. An audience forever hungry ensures each step feeds rumor. That, too, could be useful if one wished a message devoured by many. By noon, they sat with tea in the Fox and Goose, their table discreet but not hidden. Love had insisted the pub was the best spot to overhear theories without needing to ask. Predictably, villagers provided a stream of elaborate explanations. A butcher announced knowledge of a secret sect making itself known by cryptic numbers. A greengrocer swore it was the choir mistress herself, scheming to replace favored hymns with modern compositions. The longer the guesses, the deeper Purbright folded behind his teacup, expression unreadable. For him, rumor was not truth but weather. It told you which way winds blew, not what lay at their origin. Halfway through his second cup, the inn's maid came nervously to their table. "Begging pardon, Inspector, but the vicar's been looking everywhere for you. They found something again back at the church." The words cut through the smoker's haze, sobering the room into instant interest. Purbright rose, set his hat upon his head, and glanced at Love. "You see, Sergeant, our correspondent wastes no time in keeping his audience engaged. A poor dramatist would delay between acts. A true one understands the necessity of cadence." They made their way quickly to the abbey. Here, in the pulpit, lay the newest twist. The organist had opened her bench to find a folded hymn page tucked beneath the cushion. It was not torn at random. It bore in a careful hand a verse altered to read not of heaven's choir, but of a voice forever stilled. The congregation had not yet seen it, but the staff already whispered in alarm. The organist pressed her lips together as if she herself were the intended target. Love stared at the paper in disbelief. "Another note, sir, but this one was made from the missing page itself." Purbright handled it lightly. "So we see the pattern complete. Tear from the common, return it disguised, unsettle the unsuspecting. The voice, Sergeant, always the voice." He turned toward the vicar, who hovered, worried like a man fearing blame. "Tell me, Reverend, whose voice here in Flaxborough might one wish to still?" The vicar swallowed visibly, his eyes shifting elsewhere, towards the council pew, towards the choir loft, anywhere but a direct answer. That silence gave the inspector his response more clearly than words. He returned the paper to his pocket, his glance steady, final. Then we must find not who envies a voice, but who fears one being raised. Rain began to fall just as Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love left the abbey once more, the drops slanting in with a gust that plastered ribbons of hymn sheets to the cobblestones outside. Flaxborough under rain was not much different from Flaxborough under sun. Its citizens only carried their gossip indoors. Still, the drizzles seemed to suit the mood of the town. The vicar had declined to follow them out, staying in the vestry with slumped shoulders as though his own voice had already been removed. Love pulled his coat collar high and kept stride beside Purbright. "That note in the organ bench, sir, that's got to narrow it down, surely. Not everyone would have access, not without being seen. Either the organist left her key about, or someone knew their way into locked spaces." He sounded as if the explanation might at last make this puzzle bite-sized, something digestible within the pages of his notebook. Purbright gave a slight tilt of his head, allowing rain to bead upon the brim of his hat. You see how carefully each placement was chosen: an unused collection bag, the hymn board, the organ bench. Our author has knowledge, not brute luck. Access, yes, but also timing. That is where suspicion must lean. These acts are not for secrecy, Sergeant. They are for performance. If the audience already whispers in suspicion, what better than to plant props where the stage is certain? Love scribbled furiously, his pen dragging rain onto the page. But who benefits from all this performance? What do they gain by frightening people with missing hymns and talk of silenced voices? Purbright slowed his pace to watch rain chase rivulets down the Abbey's stonework. What might one gain by ensuring a voice is not heard, Sergeant? Silence is rarely sought for silence's sake. It is protection, sometimes for the speaker, sometimes for the listener, more often for those who fear the words. The inspector gave a half-smile. One wonders if voice is meant literally, or if it is a more convenient metaphor. They crossed into the square where townsfolk sheltered beneath shop eaves, all eager to see what direction the inspector's footsteps took. His presence was as conspicuous as a headline, and indeed by the time they reached the council offices, 2 boys had already slipped away, likely running to tell others. Purbright, unperturbed, rapped lightly upon the council's oak door. They were admitted by a clerk who looked both curious and nervous, as if yesterday's gossip had already fingered the entire staff as suspects. The council chamber itself was dim, dusted with the musty smell of stored minutes and forgotten bylaws. Alderman Hargreaves sat at the long table with papers before him, though it was plain he'd been waiting, not working. His bluster of the previous night seemed restrained now, lips pursed too tightly. By his side sat Councilman Dacre, equally severe, yet too ready with a glare. Purbright observed them both before remarking only upon the brass paperclips stacked neatly beside Dacre's blotter. Love noticed as well, his mouth opening in triumph. "Sir, the very same sort as we found in the Hymnal." Dacre snorted, a sound rehearsed to imply innocence affronted. "Paperclips, Sergeant, are not a restricted resource. Every clerk in England uses them." "Indeed," murmured Purbright, his gaze drifting over ledgers stacked precisely to one side. "And yet their use here appears devoutly excessive. One wonders how many sheets demand such fastening." A silence fell with weight enough to test patience. Finally, the alderman shifted in his chair. "Inspector, you're reading significance into stationery. This town has a dreadful habit of inflating gossip into gospel. We should not dignify such silliness by granting it council discussion." "Then perhaps," Purbright said calmly, "the discussion should shift from the council hall to the choir loft, where last night's hymn numbers were rearranged to highlight the very pages missing from your parish's hymnals, a trick which, according to my information, requires prior knowledge of those editions. Such knowledge is not widely available beyond the Abbey. The council library—" He let the sentence fade with dangerous gentleness, inviting completion without forcing it. The alderman cleared his throat, furious at the trap of words. Dacre, less skilled in verbal fencing, snapped back, "And what of it? If I do read hymnals in my spare time, that hardly makes me responsible for childish vandalism." "Very true," Purbright said evenly. "Such reading declares diligence, perhaps reverence. Yet the act we investigate declares performance. May I ask, councilman, how you spent your hours when Mrs. Tunley saw a tall figure by the vestry last week? The question landed like a hymn sung off-key. Dacre's colour shifted. The alderman placed a warning hand upon his arm. Enough, Inspector. My colleague's time is valuable. You cannot accuse without proof. But Purbright did not accuse, not directly. He simply turned, nodding once. Proof is not given. It is revealed. In time. With that, he exited as calmly as he had entered, leaving Love in harried pursuit. Outside, raindrops smudged Love's notes even as he tried to preserve them. Sir, forgive me if I say so, but you nearly cornered him back there. Why not press harder? He looked guilty enough to confess. Those who look guilty under pressure, Sergeant, may merely be guilty of temper. Too often we arrest tempers and leave crimes to go free. Purbright's eyes roved across the square. No, the play demands a larger audience yet. Whoever writes these notes has not concluded his verse. We must wait until his next stanza, if only to know whose voice he intends to silence. As if upon cue, the sexton came hurrying across the slick stones, cloak darkened by rain. Breathless, he blurted in panic, "Inspector!" "There's been, oh mercy, there's been another." Purbright raised one eyebrow, the only concession to surprise. "Where this time?" "In the choir loft," the sexton wheezed, wiping rain from his brow. "Inside one of the organ pipes, slipped clean down inside, folded so tight. We only found it when the sound turned wrong during practice, like a cough in the middle of a hymn." Together, they hurried back to the abbey. The choir mistress stood pale with fury, waving an offending scrap. On it, scrawled in the same neat hand, a single line cut from another hymn. "When voices join, beware the one too loud." Love's face betrayed the chill it sent up his spine. So now someone's warning against a particular person, someone who stands out when they sing. Purbright accepted the paper, holding it between thumb and finger as gently as if it were a moth's wing. "Or someone who stands out in speaking, Sergeant. Beware the loud." He tucked it carefully away, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the nave. The storm grows louder, only so the silence after may be complete. The choir mistress looked near tears. The vicar wrung his hands. Parish gossip would have enough material for years. Yet Purbright saw only the next act being prepared. The audience had not been disappointed, and the dramatist, whatever he or she was keeping perfect rhythm. The parchment slip rescued from the organ pipe still bore the faint tang of dust and brass when Purbright placed it on the vestry table alongside the other fragments. They now formed a small collection, each artifact a stanza in a longer performance. Torn hymnal pages, rearranged numbers, polished brass clips, and phrases promising silence. Sergeant Love stood over them with the furrowed brow of a man trying to make arithmetic produce poetry. You can practically see the story forming, sir. First the hymn board, then the notes, now this message hiding in an organ pipe. He's building something, but what? It's like we're chasing a magician, only he keeps leaving clues for us to follow. Purbright turned the page delicately toward the light. "No magician, Sergeant. Magicians aim to distract. This hand does not disguise at all. It draws us close on purpose. It is not a pursuit so much as an invitation." Love forced a chuckle, but found no humor in it. "All the same, sir, invitations like this usually end with knives on the table." "Or," Purbright murmured, with a voice missing from it. Later that afternoon, when word of the organ pipe note had inevitably seeped through the church and spilt into the high street, Flaxborough buzzed with speculation, new and fevered. In the Fox and Goose, patrons debated whose too loud voice the note condemned. The butcher's booming tenor, the schoolmaster's sermons, the choir mistress's imperious solos. Down by the market square, mutterings turned serious. Was it Alderman Hargreave himself, given his blustering roar at public meetings? More suspiciously, Was it Councilman Dacre, who rarely missed a chance to hear his own opinions echoed? Every corner of town rehearsed its preference for culprits, each new suspicion secretly revealing more about the accuser than about the accused. Miss Ardley's name floated discreetly among more intellectual circles. Who else, they reasoned, would take such pleasure in rearrangements of word and verse? Who else had at hand the additions to cross-check? She responded firmly to early whispered questions from the Women's Guild with cool disdain, ensuring her innocence was loudly professed, and yet thought of all the more actively behind her back. Purbright and Love walked these currents like fishermen gauging rivers. They let the eddies swirl without attempting to stop them, for gossip was both map and misdirection. One learned not truth but pressure. Love, unable to restrain himself, jotted theories as they streamed past. Some say, sir, the organist herself planted the paper just to stir drama. Jealousy runs thick in choirs, so I hear. Yes, jealousy does enjoy music almost as much as harmony does, Purbright said with a nod. However, jealousy rarely tidies its mischief so neatly with lemon oil and brass clips. That scent was not born of hymnals. Love blinked. You mean furniture polish, like you said before? Indeed. Purbright slowed, pausing before the council chambers once more. The brass handles gleamed wet from drizzle, although few bothered to polish them. The polish returns. It remains where it is not expected and is absent where it should be. Absence is often a form of note itself. Inside the chamber, they encountered Councilman Dacre, alone, his sleeves rolled, muttering over paperwork. He glanced up with irritation, poorly masked as cheer. Inspector, back again. I hope you've come to bring an end to this foolishness, not add to it. Purbright simply strolled forward, eyes lingering briefly on the shine of desk surfaces and the faint aroma of lemon oil rising from wood. Tell me, Councilman, did you attend choir in your youth? The question unsettled him, eliciting a cough. Yes, once, years ago. What of it? It is merely that one who rearranges hymns with such accuracy would likely have sung them often. Purbright's voice remained mild. Do you still sing? Dacre shifted in his chair. Don't be absurd. I have no time for trifles. Love scribbled furiously but looked toward Purbright in search of direction. The inspector gave none, merely inclining his head in thanks and turning away without further word. To press now would only force defenses higher. Better to leave suspicion simmering, its temperature rising until truths escaped with the steam. As evening drew in, a new disturbance awaited. The curate, sent in search of candles within a dusty storage cabinet, had discovered yet another page folded square as a letter. He brought it crumpled within his trembling hand, sure of its malice before even opening it. Love unfolded it quickly, eager to seize progress. The altered hymn verse read, "Better a town without song than a song with a false voice." A long silence followed, thicker than any storm. Purbright read it twice and slid it back into the boy's hand, gently. You see, Sergeant, each note does not simply threaten silence. It demands purity of sound, authenticity of voices. Our author is not destroying music, but correcting it to his measure. He perceives dissonance somewhere within this choir, and seeks its silence. Love frowned. So, someone in the choir? The organist, the choir mistress, or one of the singers? Someone who thinks their voice is false and wants them gone. Or someone who fears what that voice may sing outside the hymn book, Purbright countered. Voices are not always literal. The curate's gaze darted nervously. Inspector, might he truly strike at someone? Silence them entirely. Purbright's eyes lingered upon the boy. My dear young man, I fear that is entirely the point. As word spread once again through town, the speculation became feverish. Neighbors eyed neighbors differently. Conversations hushed when a singer by trade passed near. What voice, what truth, threatened so greatly that someone would orchestrate this elaborate silencing? And if so, How far would they go to finish their hymn? That night, Purbright did not retire early. He sat quietly at his small desk, the fragments aligned in ordered sequence before him like players waiting within the wings of a darkened stage. He stared at the words, the careful cuts, the scents and clips, and considered the patience of the one who placed them. Patience, but urgency too, always discovered, never withheld. Each act demanded discovery at the precise moment. That was no vandal's mischief. It was a rehearsal for something performed live. Love, who had dozed uneasily in a chair opposite, woke with a start when Purbright finally spoke after an hour of unwavering silence. "Tomorrow, Sergeant, we shall stand in the square at the choir's practice. Our correspondent has not yet chosen his loud voice to still, but he will. And when he does, Flaxborough will sing its loudest chorus of suspicion. We must be sure to hear the truth among its notes." The following afternoon, the Abbey Square rang not with hymns, but with preparations for choir practice. Voices tuned themselves in hesitant scales. The choir mistress stalked among altos and sopranos with an expression suggesting both discipline and suppressed dread. Parishioners not remotely connected to the choir had also arrived under transparent pretenses, lingering near market stalls, leaning on railings, and waiting for something suspicious to unfold. If the chorus was to rehearse, Flaxborough promised itself an overture in scandal. Purbright stood slightly apart with Sergeant Love, his hat brim lowered against the pale sun, eyes tracing movements both anxious and deliberate. For him, the chorus was less music than evidence, each placement of benches or adjustment of hymn books, another stroke on a chalk diagram only he could see. "Observe, Sergeant," he murmured, "how quickly curiosity becomes vigilance. Half the town believes itself detective now, although the guilty prefers no such mirrors turned back." Love glanced over his notebook suspiciously at the faces gathered. "If the culprit is here, sir, they'll be watching as hard as we are. That is precisely why they cannot resist attending. A dramatist always watches his performance." Inside the Abbey, sound began with awkward harmony. Boys cracked notes, sopranos clutched their throats, and one tenor sang proudly half a key away from sense. The choir mistress ruthlessly pushed them back to pitch. Purbright's gaze, however, lingered not on harmony, but on glances. Who eyed whom with unease, who shifted nervously when their turn came to sing. When a teacher-like baritone faltered, Alderman Hargreave grumbled loudly from the back that even the town's money wasted upon organ upkeep could not save such dreadful sound. That remark resonated too clearly with the line from the organ pipe note, and the ripple of glances that followed marked him as a fresh suspect in half the listeners' minds. An hour into practice, as throats grew raw, the organist lifted her lid to unveil the bench and nearly sobbed when nothing awaited inside. The relief that swept through the gathered villagers was strangely unpleasant. The crowd had come for drama, not resolution, but their hunger was swiftly fed. Just as the choir mistress prepared to dismiss her weary chorus, a loose page fell suddenly from between the sheet music on her stand. It floated down, gently almost, but as laden with portent as any thunderclap. Love lunged forward, intercepting it mid-floor. The words, scrawled across an excised hymn verse, read, "The loudest voice commands silence first." Gasps scattered the pews. The choir mistress recoiled, clutching her shawl. Love turned wide eyes toward Purbright. "He's done it again, sir. Right under our noses, even with half the town watching. How on earth?" Purbright accepted the scrap, smoothing it across his palm. His eyes lingered longer than usual, then rose outward toward the watching villagers. "How on earth," he repeated softly, "is the question our author most desires you to ask." Whispers soon multiplied in the air. Some swore the note had been slipped by the organist herself. Others pointed to the vicar looking pale as candle wax, while a fresh wave of suspicion surged toward Dacre, who had remained conspicuously absent from the choir practice altogether. Yet the most vicious mutters now turned toward Alderman Hargreave, whose bombastic voice at council meetings easily qualified as the loudest in Flaxborough. By the time practice fell apart in dismay, half the town was prepared to silently accuse him. Love cornered Purbright by the vestry. "Sir, they'll riot with gossip if we don't do something. That last note, the loudest voice, it fits him well enough. Everyone says so." Purbright gently tapped the folded paper against his palm, smiling thinly. "It is too perfect a fit, Sergeant. Remember, the goal is not merely to accuse, but to convince an entire town to accuse on cue. Which voice do you silence most easily? The very one everyone expects to be silenced. Our dramatist is writing not only notes, but audience reactions." Love bit the end of his pencil, dismayed. "So, someone's framing him? Or framing more than him. The play grows crowded with suspects, while the author remains serenely backstage." By early evening, the Fox and Goose swelled with villagers dissecting the practice. Tears and outrage mingled with dark delight. The choir mistress vowed she would sooner cancel the Easter anthem than risk another humiliation. Meanwhile, Miss Ardley insisted the precision of page removal, hymn indexing, and phrase construction could only point to someone of scholarly temperament, though her audience slyly noted her own scholarly tendencies in return. Even the town doctor allowed himself to speculate that some psychological malady was at work, perhaps a patient obsessed with voices, which only elevated the drama further. Through it all, Purbright remained almost jovial in his restraint, sipping his modest ale and letting rumor swirl around him like storm winds tethered to an anchor. Love eventually broke. "I don't see how you keep cheerful, sir. Every clue leaves us with a fresh suspect. Every note heightens panic. If voices are to be silenced, then time is running short, isn't it?" Purbright placed his glass carefully down and leaned closer with rare weight in his words. "Time is not what's running short, Sergeant. Patience is. Our author thrives on rhythm, the reveal, the audience, the reaction. Each act quickens. The pace grows tighter, which means the climax is near. When it arrives, the voice targeted will stand revealed, not by chance, but by necessity. That is when our dramatist leaves the script behind and acts in earnest." The sergeant swallowed hard, imagining a dagger in the next hymn book or a throat caught mid-verse. "And if we don't stop it? Then the performance achieves its conclusion, and Flaxborough will remember this Easter not for hymns sung, but for a voice forever stilled." Purbright settled back, expression serene as if he were merely discussing the weather. "Between the two, I prefer a hymn." The lamps were being lit across town when another runner appeared. This time a young choir boy no older than 12, dripping with sweat though not from exercise alone. He burst into the pub in search of the inspector, lips parted, eyes wide with barely checked panic. "They've found one more, sir," he stammered. "Hidden in the pulpit cushion. The vicar sat upon it by mistake during evening prayer." The room fell silent around him. In the sudden hush, even the Fox and Goose's ever-cheerful clock tick sounded like a drum beat. Purbright rose calmly, drawing his coat about his shoulders. "You see, Sergeant," he whispered with unfailing mildness, "the dramatist knows his climax requires rehearsal's end. Soon the curtain rises. Let us not keep him waiting." The pulpit note, discovered under the unsuspecting vicar's weight, and was carried into the vestry with as much reverence as shock would allow. The poor reverend, cheeks flushed to a boiled scarlet, insisted he had felt the offending corner jabbing him like a thistle mid-prayer, and had leapt from the pulpit in alarm. When unfolded, the page whispered the most direct words yet, "One voice will fall, so that harmony may rise." The vestry chamber fell utterly silent as Purbright read it aloud in tones so even they only sharpened the menace. Love's pencil scratched furiously. "There it is, sir. He's promising to act, not just threatening anymore. He's telling us straight. One voice to be silenced. It has to be Hargreave, everyone says so. Loudest, rudest, most likely target. The crowd will have him guilty by morning. Precisely why we must suspect otherwise, Sergeant, Purbright replied, folding the note neatly as if it was simply a library receipt. Our dramatist wants accusation laid as easily as hymn numbers on a board. Everyone is staring in the same direction, so no one notices where the true stage is set. In the black hours that followed, Flaxborough clotted with rumour dense enough to block passage of reason. In corners of parlours and above half-pint mugs, people nodded grimly, already resigned to the notion that some thunderbolt, or worse, would strike Alderman Hargreave. For was he not the loudest? Had he not thundered first against childish vandalism? Nothing fits a trap more snugly than a victim already cast by audience applause. The next day's choir practice gathered an audience double that of the night before. Townsfolk came not merely from interest, but from dark anticipation. Nothing so compels a community as the expectation of scandal, breathing hot upon certainty. Hargreave himself, seemingly aware of the muttering around his shoulders, sat in the front pew with his stick upright before him in an act of defiance. Yet hidden beneath his gruff defiance was the twitch of fear, of being chosen, of being the voice. Purbright and Love took their places unobtrusively at the side, though in truth the inspector's mere presence declared half the spectacle. Love whispered nervously, "What do you think he'll do, sir? Strike in the middle of rehearsal? Silence Hargreave mid-sentence?" Purbright regarded the frail candle flames quivering in the draught. The dramatist desires an audience. Therefore, Sergeant, the climax cannot come in shadows or whispers. It comes at a crescendo, when every watcher leans furthest forward. That moment, be assured, that is when he writes his final line. Rehearsal began shakily. Sopranos sang softer than normal. Basses watched the aldermen rather than following their notes. The organ strained, and yet each moment of ordinary sound carried more tension than silence could. Then, when the chorus reached its first fortissimo, when voices strained loud enough to brave rafters, the sudden clap of wood resounded sharper than any note. A hymn book had slammed shut by itself, no hand visibly near. The startled choir stopped as one, breath halting. In the gape of silence, the alderman rose awkwardly, glaring upon all sides as if to challenge fate itself. Then the discovery. Wedged between the pages of that fallen hymn book lay another folded fragment. Panic ran like a tremor through the room. Love dashed forward, retrieved it, his voice breaking as he read aloud, "Tonight the loudest voice ends. Tomorrow, Flaxborough sings without discord." The church erupted. Women gasped, some wept, the organist shrieked. In the crush of voices, Hargreave barked something about arresting the whole choir, while others whispered darkly that he must have planted the note himself. Fear and fury ground together. Love turned wild-eyed to Purbright. "Sir, this is it. He's announcing murder. Tonight, Hargreave's life could truly be—" Purbright raised a hand, stilling him in an instant. His gaze swept the panicked crowd, not with alarm, but with curious detachment, as though each frantic face were another clue upon his desk. You notice, Sergeant, how efficiently a single scrap of paper sings louder than a dozen lungs. One need only say "tonight," and the town supplies every terror for itself. He let the words sink as he calmly folded the page alongside its sinister siblings. Fear composes half the symphony. Nevertheless, precaution demanded more. Unwilling yet to dismiss, Purbright brought Hargreave under gentle persuasion back to his council chamber for safety. The alderman thundered, but fear beneath the volume betrayed him. Love stationed himself near the chamber door with zealous earnestness, notebook at the ready and eyes darting between keyholes and chimney flues as though assassins might drop from either. Evening fell oppressively as storm clouds teased thunder beyond the horizon. No further notes appeared, yet that absence served only to heighten expectation. By lantern, Purbright wrote out his patient deductions in neat script, his mind rearranging the drama's sequence as a conductor rehearses a score. The tempo quickening, the clear choice of scapegoat, the intoxicating spectacle of terror, these were not the gestures of brute grudge, but of calculated theatre. When midnight bells began to toll, Love stiffened at his post. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. The curate entered timidly, pale and wringing hands. He claimed he had come to ensure Alderman's safety at the vicar's request. His words tumbled clumsily, his eyes never arriving at Purbright's. At once, the inspector rose and touched Love's notebook gently downward. "Thank you, young man, though no voice finds safety by mere attendance. Safeguarding is the work of seeing rather than sitting. Tell me, how does one strike at a loud voice most effectively?" The curate faltered, lips leaving silence. Purbright's gaze softened but carried steel beneath calm. One strikes before others discover it was never the target at all. When everyone watches a glaring mouth, no one sees the quieter figure with a pen in hand. Love gasped, half comprehending. "Sir, you don't mean—" Purbright's voice, low but firm, rippled like organ bass. "The dramatist is not killing voices. He is arranging them into a chorus of fear to drown a single other voice out. The notes were never about Alderman Hargreave. They were a diversion. What voice in Flaxborough, Sergeant, would most threaten silence by speaking? Which confession, if sung aloud, could undo a man more completely than death?" The curate's collapse into sobbing words choked any further mystery. He confessed tremulously, insisting he meant no bloodshed, that he only wished to still the vicar's plans to reveal certain financial irregularities to the council, plans that would ruin him through exposure. "I thought if the town looked elsewhere," he stammered, "if they braced for scandal upon Hargreave, the vicar's whisper would matter less. He would have no chance to be heard among such noise." The quiet confession shivered into silence. Purbright folded his hands behind his back, expression gentle as though only faintly disappointed. "So you chose paper, not a knife. You orchestrated silence to drown a single voice, to turn harmony into mimicry, fear into a chorus. In doing so, you risked a louder tragedy than you imagined. Words, my boy, can suffocate faster than hands." Love, stunned, scratched final notes, even as the curate collapsed fully to his knees. The alderman, pale and shaken, muttered incoherent oaths of relief, though already considering how best to trumpet his victimhood across town. Purbright, however, showed no triumph. Only weariness draped his shoulders like heavy velvet. "Voices," he remarked softly, "are choirs, whether alone or among thousands. To silence one selfishly is to corrupt the hymn of all." And thus, Flaxborough's scandal reached its crueler resonance, less in daggers than in whispers, more in calculated paper than blood. Yet the town, as dawn readied its light, would wake convinced it had scarcely avoided murder, a conviction far more thrilling than truth could easily undo. The confession within the dimly lit council chamber had been scarcely whispered into the air before Sergeant Love erupted with triumph. His notebook filled with furious rows of exclamations, doodled arrows blazing toward the meek curate hunched at his knees. "There we are, sir, all explained at last. He admits it. These notes, the hymnals, the whole performance. It was his scheme from the start. We've caught him out neat and proper." His excitement made him overlook the curate's racked sobbing, the young man trembling like an instrument struck far too harshly. Purbright, ever unhurried, placed a quiet hand upon Love's ink-smeared pages, stilling both pen and judgment. Caught, at present, in panic, perhaps. Confession carries a curious habit, Sergeant. It often trembles between truth and desire. He may desire relief from fear as much as admit to guilt. His voice, calm and weighty in its gentleness, held the curate's quivering attention more firmly than Love's bluster. The curate raised hollow eyes, the whites reddened as though he had rehearsed many nights. He stammered again that he feared exposure of irregularities, small skimmings from parish funds that the vicar intended to name at the council meeting, a shame that would drive him from post, if not from town. I had no plan to kill, none at all, he gasped, fingers clutching at his thin cassock. I thought to build noise around another, to drown his voice with dread, before he quieted mine forever. Love could hardly contain disdain. But he admits it, sir. He fits everything. Access to vestry, knowledge of hymnals, chance to slip notes about. We'd be daft to look elsewhere. Purbright's expression performed its rarest shift. A thin line, neither smile nor frown, merely a suggestion of depth unplumbed. Indeed, every clue within reach of his hands. Yet ask yourself, Sergeant, were they meant to be clues or props? Would a frightened curate, anxious only to misdirect, polish his paper with lemon oil and align paper clips like signatures? Would he challenge the town with riddles of voices, orchestrate the audience with precision lines of performance? Or would he, as most afraid men do, stumble? Sometimes confession reveals only authorship of panic, not authorship of plot. The curate whimpered lowly, struck by quiet ambiguity. His guilt, so easily proclaimed moments before, now struggled against the inspector's feather touch of reason. Love groaned in exasperation. You mean to say he may only think he's guilty, when all along someone stronger played him as their fall guy? That's wilder than any of their notes. No wilder than townsfolk choosing Alderman Hargreave as scapegoat, Purbright replied softly. The dramatist knew well how to supply the audience with simplicity. Perhaps he supplies the curate likewise, encouraging him to shoulder authorship by misplaced fear. Simple explanations comfort both town and conscience, but simplicity, Sergeant, is seldom trustworthy. Love sputtered, helpless. He forced words into his notebook margin. Curate equals confessed / inspector equals doubts. Then he sucked air through his teeth. Then who else, sir? If not him, then back to Dacre. He had the shine of polish about him, the quick temper, the knowledge of hymnals. He bristled every time you questioned him. Before Purbright could reply, a knock jarred the chamber door, bringing them all to stiffened attention. It was the vicar himself, pale cheeks sagging as if burdened by more sleepless nights than he had hours with Scripture. Clutched in his fist trembled yet another folded page. I meant to pray, he muttered weakly, but found this instead upon the pulpit steps. Slipped there sometime between our departure and my return. Love seized it, breath rushing fast. The words, scrawled upon still another hymn fragment, declared, "Truth shall be sung when false voices are hushed." The script is identical to before. Steady, deliberate. The curate collapsed further, protesting, "Not I, Inspector, not this one. I swear it. I've been here the whole while. You have seen me." His voice echoed low against his chest. Purbright studied the page, eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with faint disappointment. "Indeed you were here, as was I, which proves our drama has not exhausted itself. The dramatist writes still and wants us to know so." Love's hands nearly shook the page to tatters. "But then, someone still free, still scheming, they'll never stop. Sir, how do we keep the whole town from tearing itself apart with blame before he makes good on all this?" "The same way one manages a choir, Sergeant," Purbright said, slipping the paper into his breast pocket. "By directing tempo, crafting silence, and ensuring each note enters by design, rather than by accident. Tomorrow, at the service, the dramatist must attempt his climax. Too long a pause between acts, and the audience strays. He cannot risk that. He will announce himself then, whether he intends or not." The curate begged forgiveness, his voice a broken reed. Purbright only motioned him back to his chair kindly. "You played a part written for you by fear, my boy. Fear convinced you you were its author. You may leave that stage now. Another hand pens this drama still." Sleep did not easily find Flaxborough that night. Even private walls hummed with gloomy rumor, predictions spoken with certainty dripping like rain through leaky roofs. Half the town believed Hargreave would end the night dead, the other half whispered it was the curate who would hang. Somewhere between these extremes, however, a smaller circle began to suspect vicar or counsel. Still others, the librarian, whose meticulous nature fitted too well. Every suspicion added fuel, but each flame lit only a shadow behind them. At dawn, Purbright walked the cobbles slowly, his breath misting, his ear tuned to the murmurs curling from open windows, waiting for that day's hymn to be written not by choir, but by whisper. Love plodded at his side, frustrated. "So you mean to sit through the whole service tomorrow waiting for the fellow to tip his own hand? That's a terrible risk if he means something worse than paper this time." "A terrible risk," echoed Purbright agreeably, hands tucked behind his back. "But risk is the dramatist's weakness. To reach the climax, he must show himself, Sergeant. To control the reaction, he must expose the stage and voice together. All theatre reveals the author at the final curtain." As bells tolled to summon the faithful, townsfolk gathered tense with foreknowledge of spectacle, unwilling yet delighted to witness calamity play upon their own pews. Suspects filed in, Miss Ardley, aloof yet severe, Hargreave rumbling like caged thunder, Dacre stiff with concealed nerves, the vicar hollow-eyed beside his curate, who followed small as shadow. Faces leaned forward with dread and illicit hunger, as each soul wondered whether silence would fall tonight upon another's throat. Purbright advanced calmly, the tide of unease parting round him like reeds about a steady boat. He lowered himself into the rear pew, never truly part of the congregation, yet entirely at its heart. Love sat beside him, gripping his pencil as a soldier gripped a musket. The choir mistress raised her baton, the organ swelled with solemn roar, and service began. But the congregation sang a far different song than their books prescribed. Fear, suspicion, anticipation. The inspector sat still within it all, knowing he waited not for verse but for curtain call. Somewhere amid those voices, louder in absence than in sound, the dramatist prepared his final act. The church filled slowly but thickly, as though every citizen of Flaxborough had contrived to find a legitimate excuse for presence. Umbrellas dripped into the aisles, hats steamed faintly. Whispers bounded from pew to pew like bats disturbed in rafters. Purbright observed how every eye seemed more attuned to neighbours than to prayer. Surprise no longer lived here. The whole town had rehearsed itself for the climax. Any scrap of paper now would ring louder than the organ. The service began in a stiffness that could scarcely be called worship. Hymn numbers were announced with the brittle effort of the vicar, his lips struggling over syllables as if each word feared interruption. Pages turned at once like rifle fire. The choir sang, but every note in the nave trembled beneath anticipation. Not song itself, but what drama might burst through it. Hargreave scowled heavily through his responses, jaw stiff with dread wrapped beneath defiance. Dacre sat pale, his fingers tapping his knees in nervous rhythm. Miss Ardley's sharp profile fixed the pulpit with hawkish vigilance, while the curate shrank one moment, then swelled another, as though praying not to be seen yet yearning for absolution if caught. Sergeant Love muttered low beside the inspector, unable to keep his nerves inside his notebook. "It'll happen this morning, sir. The dramatist won't resist it, not with the eyes of a whole town waiting. There'll be another note, maybe worse." "Quite so, Sergeant," Purbright intoned very quietly, "though whether it is hymn or dirge remains to be seen." As voices swelled toward the psalm, the moment came. A slip of paper drifted, not planted beneath a bench or cushion, but descending almost artlessly from the gallery above. The congregation froze the instant it touched an aisle. A woman shrieked softly. Hargreave bellowed something incoherent. Love dashed forward, heart hammering as he grasped it from the stone floor. In bold, unfaltering hand, it read, "The loudest voice now sings its last." The uproar was instant. Cries of "Murder!" and "Stop him!" split the nave. Several men lurched protectively toward Hargreave, while others shouted accusations at Dacre, or even the vicar. The choir collapsed into noisy confusion. Only Purbright remained seated, still as carved oak. He rose with deliberate slowness, his figure drawing immediate hush as though the whole town clung to his next sentence for definition of fear itself. "My friends," he said, soft but cutting, "a voice is indeed about to end, though not by murder. It ends because the performance is over." He gestured lightly toward the gallery above. "Our dramatist, in seeking climax, has at last exposed himself, not by mistakes of ink or paperclip, nor even by lemon oil, but because theatre always requires a stage." A sweep of heads turned upward. There, half hidden among choir stalls, Miss Ardley stood frozen, the string of her handbag slack in one hand. From it protruded scraps of hymn pages, clipped and folded. She who had most eagerly declared expertise had also most carefully orchestrated each exhibit. Villagers gasped. A few clapped their hands to their mouths. Love stammered, his words broken between shock and vindication. "The librarian, Miss Ardley." "Sir, you mean it's been her this whole time?" Purbright's nod was almost courteous. Who else dwelt so deeply among editions, knew which verses had shifted across printings, who could pluck the precise numbers to unsettle memory? Who else commanded the silenced drumbeat of townsfolk simply by treating a hymn book as an index entry? She invited herself to be custodian of narrative, Sergeant, and none took record more seriously than she. The librarian's lips parted, but not in denial. A strange pride glowed within her eyes. "You noticed," she breathed, her voice sharp as a quill scratch. "I doubted any here could read beneath the noise. Forgive me, Inspector, but I was compelled to act. This town decays each year into falsehoods, voices raised to boast and bluster, drowning true learning with claptrap. Councilmen fat on port, a vicar blind to embezzlements, singers bawling tuneless praises. Why should the hymnals not stand corrected? Why should silence not consume falsity?" Shock tangled across pews, outrage scored over confusion, but Ardley stood straighter the more they stared. "I never meant blood, only to demonstrate corruption, to show them all that their voices had grown dissonant. It was art, Inspector. Necessary theatre." Purbright's expression softened only with pity. But theatre turned parish against parish, threatened the innocent with fear, and forgot that even false notes are voices of the choir. You could not silence one without corrupting all. That was your truest miscalculation, Miss Ardley. You mistook performance for correction. Her glare flashed, pride wounded but not forsaken. Love seized her sizable handbag and removed the sharpened scissors with which the pages had been excised, a small, precise tool gleaming faintly even here in the house of prayer. Murmurs swelled. Realization spread, palpably as flame in straw. She was taken into custody with more reluctance than struggle, still muttering fragments of verse as if scoring her own arrest. By then, the congregation, relieved to see the drama finish in apprehension rather than death, rippled with noisy release. Some denounced her at once, others felt betrayal, having long entrusted themselves to her order. Yet some admired her resolve, if not her madness, and more than one whispered how thrilling it had been to be part of such theatre at all. Love scribbled "Case closed" triumphantly across his last page, then muttered to Purbright, "Simple in the end, wasn't it, sir? Just the woman we all thought odd from the start." Purbright's eyebrow rose kindly. Simple, after rehearsals are enough. She herself knew that the climax could not be delayed. The audience must be rewarded. His eyes wandered across the dispersing crowd, sharp still. Yet beware calling it only oddness, Sergeant, for each gossip lent her strength. Every eager theory breathed life into her drama. Flaxborough sang in her choir more loudly than she herself wrote. Outside, fresh air carried off some of the tension, though villagers lingered to dissect every stage of the affair. The curate stood pale, humiliated by his false confession. Purbright touched his shoulder lightly, a benediction more forgiving than a sermon. "Fear makes a poor librettist, my boy. Keep to homilies. Choirs suffer enough composers." The square began to empty at last. Merchants reopened shutters, and the Fox and Goose readied its next round of tales over a pint. Cries of "Did you hear who it was?" already fluttered street to street with gleeful exaggeration. Some claimed Ardley confessed to plotting poison. Others insisted she had plotted revolution through psalmody. The truth, Purbright knew, would be replaced by rumor the moment ink dried on his own report. Love sighed heavily beside him, relief loosening his shoulders. "Well, at least it's over. Must say, sir, I never thought missing hymn pages could stir such fright. And now the final voice will not be silenced after all." Purbright adjusted his hat, serene as the morning clearing into light. "On the contrary, Sergeant, one voice has indeed been silenced, Miss Ardley's, but others will rise noisier in its place, until next time quiet proves itself suspicious again. For that is Flaxborough. Its hymn is gossip, eternal and untidy. We merely conduct." He walked away with gentle steps, leaving Love puzzling at the philosophy, even above his satisfaction. Behind them, the bells tolled ordinary time once more, free of drama save to those who still hummed it in gossip's lingering refrain.